The probate lawyer closed Walter Foster's file, looked across the conference table, and said, "That is the complete probate estate." My mother smiled, not broadly. Denise Foster never did anything broadly when strangers were watching. It was the small, polished smile she wore when a room had finally arranged itself in her favor. My father, Mark, sat beside her with a yellow legal pad already covered in notes. Grandpa's house, the lake place, 2 vehicles, his checking account, the collectibles, and a 65% Class B interest in Northgate Warehouse, LLC, all passed through probate. The estate was worth a little over $2 million, and almost every visible asset went to my parents. I received one item, Grandpa's old roll-top desk and the personal papers stored inside it. My mother touched my wrist as we stood. "Your grandfather always knew what suited each of us." Dad was less careful. "The desk is what he left you. That's it. Don't make this ugly because things weren't divided evenly, Rachel." I had not said a word. That was the habit my family mistook for agreement. When a conversation became unfair, I went quiet. I told myself silence was maturity. I told myself refusing to argue meant nobody could drag me into a fight. Before we left Martin Cole, the probate attorney reviewed one final disclosure about Northgate. The estate inventory listed my parents' Class B units. He asked Dad, as personal representative, whether he knew of any separate non-probate ownership voting agreement or company amendment that materially limited how those inherited units could be pledged or used to support a warehouse refinance. "Nothing that changes what we inherited," Dad said. Mom nodded. I noticed, because both of them answered too quickly. Still, I carried the paperwork for one piece of furniture out of probate, while they left with houses, vehicles, cash, and a warehouse interest they were already discussing, as if Grandpa had been gone for years instead of weeks. Nathan helped the movers get the desk into my townhouse that evening. It was dark oak, heavier than it looked, with brass pulls worn smooth by my grandfather's hands. "At least he left you something nobody can move without a 4-man crew," Nathan said. I laughed once. It was the first easy sound I had made all day. I did not find anything dramatic that night. For the next 4 evenings, I worked through the desk slowly. Old contractor invoices, pencil stubs, stamps, receipts from diners that had closed 20 years earlier. Grandpa had kept everything, but he had organized almost none of it. On the 5th night, one detail bothered me. The bottom right drawer was shallower than the space behind it should have allowed. I pulled it out, set it on the floor, and ran my fingers along the back panel. One strip of oak was newer than the rest. 2 tiny screws held it in place. Behind the false panel was a cream envelope, a short certificate of trust, and a brass storage key stamped GF27. My name was on the envelope in Grandpa's block handwriting. Under it, one sentence: "Before you sign anything for your father, call Rebecca Hale." I read it twice. Then I looked at the certificate. Walter Foster Legacy Trust. Successor beneficiary, Rachel Foster. For closely held business interests, the certificate also named me as the post-death direction holder, while Great Lakes remained administrative trustee. The document listed one asset in detail: 35%. Class A voting interest in Northgate Warehouse, LLC, together with the approval rights described in the operating agreement. That was when I understood the desk was not the inheritance. It was the door to it. If stories about family money and the truths hidden behind polite words are your kind of story, subscribe to 10 Ken. I'm glad you're here. Now let me tell you what happened when I called the name Grandpa had left for me. Rebecca Hale answered on the 3rd ring. "Rebecca Hale. My name is Rachel Foster. Walter Foster was my grandfather." There was a pause. "Did probate conclude this week?" "Yes." "Have your parents asked you to sign anything?" "Not yet." "Good. Keep it that way until we meet." I sat down at Grandpa's desk. "Who are you?" "I was Walter's trust counsel. The certificate you found is only a summary. There is a custody packet at Great Lakes Fiduciary Services that he instructed me to release to you after probate. Can you be downtown tomorrow morning? Grandpa built Foster Industrial Supply before I was born. He started with a rented warehouse and a handful of contractors who trusted him enough to buy from a company that barely existed. By the time I was in college, he had 70 employees, municipal customers across Ohio, and a reputation for remembering exactly what someone promised even after they forgot. My father worked there for 6 years. It ended badly. Dad wanted faster expansion, more borrowing, and a second distribution center. Grandpa hated debt that did not have a clear path back to zero. Their arguments became family legend. Dad eventually left and built Foster Commercial Builders, a respectable construction company that did well for years, and then started taking on projects larger than its cash flow could comfortably carry. I never worked for Grandpa. I helped him with boring things. I scanned old invoices when his filing cabinet started winning. I labeled archive boxes. I helped him cancel software subscriptions he had forgotten he was paying for. When he sold Foster Industrial Supply 3 years before his death, I spent 2 Saturdays sorting decades of business records into keep shred and archive piles. I never opened his investment statements. I never attended an estate planning meeting. I never asked what I might inherit. That distinction would matter soon. My family also misunderstood my career, partly because I let them. Dad told people I worked at a bank. Mom preferred Rachel handles paperwork for wealthy people. The fuller version was that I was Senior Director of Fiduciary Risk and Controls at Halston Trust Group. I oversaw reviews involving trust administration, beneficiary disputes, documentation integrity, suspicious authorization, and failures in fiduciary process. I was not an estate lawyer. I did not have police powers. I could not search private accounts because I was curious, and I never used a Halston system to investigate my family. But my work had taught me one habit that Grandpa apparently understood better than anyone. Never sign a document because someone tells you what it is called. Read what it does. Nathan knew my family well enough to understand my other habit. We had been together 5 years, and he had watched me leave Sunday dinners with my shoulders tight and my voice perfectly calm. You know, silence is still an answer to them, he told me once. At least it isn't an argument. Sometimes they use it as agreement. I had ignored that because he was right. When Grandpa sold Foster Industrial Supply, the buyer paid part in cash and part through a seller finance note. Everyone knew the company had sold. Nobody in the family knew the exact structure, or at least that was what my parents allowed me to believe. Dad immediately started talking as though the sale had created a permanent family reserve. At dinner one night, he lifted his glass and said, "At least we're all set now." Grandpa looked at him. "Who's we?" Dad laughed. "The family." I said, "It's Grandpa's money." Dad gave me the look he used when he thought I was being deliberately literal. "It's his money while he's alive," he said. "Eventually, it's family money." Grandpa did not argue. He only cut another piece of steak. More than 2 years later, he had his first serious hospitalization after a cardiac episode. He recovered, slowed down, and stopped driving at night. That timeline would matter because my mother would later say he rearranged everything while sick and confused. He had not. At 9 the next morning, Rebecca met me in the lobby of Great Lakes Fiduciary Services. She was 57 silver beginning at her temples, with the calm economy of someone who did not waste words to sound important. A custody officer named Paul Brennan checked my identification, the certificate, and the brass key. Then, he brought us into a private room with no windows and placed a gray document case on the table. "Your grandfather instructed that this case be released only after the probate hearing was complete," Paul said. I used the brass key. Inside was a trust binder, an asset summary, certified correspondence copies of tax filings, and a letter from Grandpa clipped to the front. "Read the asset summary before you read my letter." So I did. The Walter Foster Legacy Trust held a municipal bond and treasury portfolio valued at approximately $1,350,000. It held the seller finance note from Foster Industrial Supply, with roughly $920,000 in principal still outstanding. and it held the 35% Class A voting interest in Northgate Warehouse LLC, valued at approximately $610,000. Total current value, about $2.88 million. I read the number twice. The desk had looked like a consolation prize. The trust behind it was worth substantially more than the visible probate estate. But the number was not the part Rebecca asked me to focus on. She turned to the Northgate operating agreement. My parents had inherited 65% of the economic interest through Class B units. Those units received distributions and represented most of the financial value of the company. The trust's 35% Class A interest carried the voting and approval rights Grandpa had retained when the company structure was reorganized years earlier. Under the directed trust terms, Great Lakes held the asset administratively. But after Grandpa's death, it could not exercise those Northgate consent rights without my written direction. A sale of the warehouse property, a new mortgage, a pledge of company, real estate, a major refinancing, or a change to the operating agreement required Class A approval. My parents had inherited the larger visible percentage. The trust had inherited the part that made certain major decisions possible. It was different from owning more. It was control over specific decisions. Then, Rebecca showed me the certified correspondence. 14 months before Grandpa died, she had sent formal notices to both my parents confirming 3 facts: the legacy trust existed, I was the named successor beneficiary, and the trust held both business sale proceeds and the Class A voting interest in Northgate. Dad had signed the certified receipt. Mom had replied to Rebecca's office by email, received. We will discuss this with Walter as a family. I stared at the records. So they knew. They were notified, Rebecca said. That is what I can prove. And at probate, Dad said there was no separate family control agreement affecting the Northgate interest. Rebecca's expression tightened. The trust itself was not probate property. It did not belong in the estate inventory. But the Class A rights are part of Northgate's operating structure. If your parents represented their inherited units as freely usable without disclosing those rights, that is something Martin may need to clarify. I opened Grandpa's letter. Rachel, if Mark is asking you to sign something, slow down before you decide whether the request sounds reasonable. Your father has always confused needing an answer with being entitled to choose it. I did not leave you the trust because I expected you to fight with him. I left it because one person has to be able to say yes or no without a family vote. Do not confuse pressure with duty. I sat back. Grandpa had not predicted a specific lender, a lawsuit, or some cinematic family betrayal. He had predicted a pattern. That was enough. We were still in the conference room when Rebecca's assistant knocked and handed her a 1-page notice. Rebecca read it once, then slid it toward me. At 8:26 that morning, my father had contacted a lender about restructuring debt connected to Foster Commercial Builders. Part of the proposed collateral package included my parents' inherited Class B interest in Northgate and a planned refinance of the warehouse property itself. The lender's review found the Class A approval requirement. The file was paused pending the trust's written Class A consent, which Great Lakes could issue only after receiving my direction. I looked at the clock. It was not even 11. My parents had left probate believing the Northgate interest was one more asset they could immediately put to work. They had not made it through the next morning before they hit the part Grandpa left outside their control. My phone started ringing before noon. Mom first, then Dad. Then Dad again. I let the first 3 go. On the 4th call, I answered. Dad did not say hello. What exactly did he leave you? There it was. No grief, no confusion. Just the question underneath everything else. I looked at the trust binder on Rebecca's table. A trust. I know there's a trust. What does it control? You signed a notice that told you. Silence. Then his voice changed. The warehouse refinance is being held over a technical issue. It's an approval right in the operating agreement. Rachel, do not start talking to me like a compliance department. Then don't call a recorded ownership right technical. He breathed through his nose. The company needs the restructuring. The Northgate piece makes the numbers work. Then restructure around the assets you control. We're family. That is not the same thing as authorization. He hung up. Mom called 20 minutes later. Her voice was softer. Nobody is asking you to give up what Grandpa left you. Your father is under enormous pressure. We just need something on paper so the lender understands the family is united. That sentence bothered me. What kind of paper? A family settlement. Nothing dramatic. The document arrived that afternoon. Family estate reconciliation and beneficiary acknowledgement. The first pages were exactly what Mom promised. Identification of the parties, confidentiality language, a preference for private mediation, a statement that everyone wanted to avoid expensive litigation. There was an initial line near the middle. For about 3 seconds, I considered signing that page just to prove I was not rejecting every family proposal on principle. Then I heard Grandpa's sentence in my head. Before you sign anything for your father, call Rebecca Hale. I forwarded the document. Rebecca called back 25 minutes later. Do not sign this. I wasn't going to sign the whole thing. Do not initial it either. Nathan was making coffee behind me while I opened the agreement on my laptop. Rebecca walked me through 3 provisions. The first was a family equalization provision. If the seller note were prepaid, if the trust's Northgate interest were sold, or if I requested certain extraordinary principal distributions, 40% of specified net proceeds would be directed into a foster family equalization account. Ordinary income was untouched. That was what made the clause sound moderate. It did not take 40% of the trust that day. It attached a future family claim to major liquidity events. The second provision named Dad as a family distribution advisor for several voluntary decisions. It did not amend Grandpa's trust or make Dad an owner, but I would contractually agree to consult him and obtain written family acknowledgement before certain major transactions. The third clause was quieter. I would acknowledge that the estate representatives had acted in good faith and made no material misrepresentation concerning known non-probate transfers, prior estate planning, or expectations of family liquidity. I read that paragraph twice. Rebecca said, "This doesn't change who owns the trust. It changes what you'd be helping them say they knew." That was the real trap. The document was not designed to steal $3 million with a one signature. It was designed to make future sharing easier, future control harder, and the past cleaner on paper than it had actually been. I did not sign it, but that did not mean I felt strong. That night, I sat on the back steps with Nathan and told him I could make the entire fight smaller with one check. $250,000, I said. Dad could stabilize the redevelopment project. Mom would stop calling everyone. The warehouse refinance wouldn't have to carry so much of the burden. Nathan looked at me for a long moment. He did not tell me what to do. He asked, "Would that end the argument or establish the price of your silence?" I hated the question because I knew the answer. I was not trying to save Dad's company. I was trying to buy quiet. The next morning I told Rebecca there would be no payment and no signature. That was when Mom changed the story. She did not accuse me of theft. That would have been too easy to disprove. Instead, she told Ryan and 2 relatives that Grandpa had been declining, that I had helped him with financial records, that I worked inside the trust world, and that somehow I ended up the sole beneficiary of almost $3 million. Ryan called me. "Why didn't you tell us you helped Grandpa set this up?" "Because I didn't. Mom says you were always doing financial things with him." I scanned invoices. "You work in trusts. I work in fiduciary risk. That's basically the same world." "No, Ryan. It is not the same as drafting Grandpa's estate plan." A day later, my parents' attorney used the phrase, "in writing." Potential undue influence. The letter pointed to my profession, my closeness to Grandpa, and the concentration of trust benefits in my name. That was when silence stopped being a personality trait and started becoming a liability. I called Rebecca. "I'm done letting them tell the only version." "Good," she said. "Then we answer with records, not volume." She scheduled a council conference for the next afternoon. My parents came with attorney Daniel Reed. Ryan came because the proposed equalization account listed him as a possible participant. Martin Cole joined by video because the discussion could affect probate disclosures. Nathan waited downstairs. He had no role in the documents, and we both wanted to keep it that way. Daniel Reed opened with the language attorneys use when they are trying to sound reasonable while making an accusation. No one is saying Rachel committed a crime. We are saying the circumstances deserve scrutiny. She had unusual access to Walter. She works with trust paperwork, and she became the sole beneficiary of a significant non-probate structure. Then he looked at me. Ms. Foster, processing trust documents professionally does not make you an estate lawyer. No, I said. I oversee fiduciary risk and control reviews at Halston Trust Group. He paused. Martin looked up from the screen. Senior Director Ediustand Starnang Kring Diton Tadel. Yes. Dad's eyes moved toward me. I did not explain my resume. I turned to Rebecca. My job was not the evidence. The records were. Rebecca started with timing. Grandpa created the Legacy Trust 26 months before his first serious hospitalization, not during his final weeks, not after a diagnosis that impaired cognition. 26 months before the medical event my mother had been using as the beginning of his supposed decline. Daniel Reed said, competent people can still be influenced. Rebecca nodded. Correct. Then she produced the capacity record. At the time the trust was executed, Grandpa had been evaluated by an independent geriatric physician. Rebecca had requested it because Walter had told her he expected family disagreement someday. The doctor documented that Grandpa was fully oriented, understood the nature of his property, could identify potential beneficiaries, and understood the consequences of transferring assets into trust. Mom changed direction. Rachel was still the person closest to him. Rebecca opened her calendars and billing records. Grandpa attended 3 planning meetings alone. My name was not on one appointment. Drafts went directly to him. Execution happened in Rebecca's office with witnesses. I had not attended. I had not received a draft. I had not been copied on funding instructions. Dad looked at me. You helped him with records. I helped him label boxes. How were we supposed to know where that ended? You could have asked him. Rebecca moved to the funding history. It was almost aggressively boring. Business sale proceeds moved into the trust in scheduled transfers over more than a year. The seller note had been titled, "To the Trust from the Beginning." Trust tax reporting had been filed normally. Northgate's Class A units had been transferred under signed company documents long before Grandpa's illness. No midnight transfer. No surprise signature in the hospital. No account drained days before death. Then, Rebecca put the certified notices on the table. Dad's receipt, Mom's email acknowledgement, both dated 14 months before Grandpa died. Daniel Reed read them in silence. Dad finally said, I knew there was a structure. I did not understand he meant to shut us out permanently. Rebecca reached for one more page. It was an email Dad had sent Grandpa 2 days after receiving the notice. If you're keeping the business sale money in Rachel's trust, at least make sure she understands the rest of us may need access someday. Grandpa's reply was one sentence. Need is not ownership. I watched Dad read his own words. The issue was no longer whether he knew. It was what he had decided that knowledge meant. You knew enough to ask Grandpa for access, I said. You chose to assume I would give it later. We're your parents. That's a relationship. It isn't consent. Mom leaned forward. Walter always wanted the family taken care of. Martin spoke from the screen. That is a fairness argument, Denise. It is not evidence that Rachel caused the trust. That distinction changed the room. Mom had been treating the result she disliked as proof the process must have been wrong. The records did not support that. Rebecca then opened the drafting history for the family agreement. Daniel Reed looked uncomfortable before she said anything. I want to clarify one point, he said. The agreement was proposed as a settlement document. I understand, Rebecca said. But Mrs. Foster specifically requested language confirming that the estate representatives had made no material misrepresentation concerning known non-probate arrangements and family liquidity expectations. Mom's face tightened. I wanted finality. Finality is a legitimate settlement goal, Rebecca said. But the clause would also have created a signed statement from Rachel supporting your position about what you knew and disclosed. Mom looked at me. Because I didn't want you accusing us of hiding anything. I held her gaze. I hadn't accused you of that when you asked for the clause. She stopped talking. That was the moment the responsibility separated. Dad had known the trust was mine. He had treated my future consent like something he could budget for, then tried to pressure me when the lender discovered expectation was not authorization. Mom had known too. But after the refinance hit the trust's approval rights, she pushed the undue influence story and asked for language that would clean up the family's historical position if I signed it. Ryan had repeated their accusations without checking them. That hurt, but he had not known about the certified notices, Dad's email, the financing assumption, or the drafting request. Different choices. Different responsibility? Ryan pushed his copy of the proposed agreement away. I didn't know any of this. Dad said, Ryan, stay out of it. Ryan looked at him. I was out of it. That's why I believed you. Martin returned to the statement made at probate about Northgate. The trust assets themselves were not probate property, he said. They did not belong in the inventory. But the estate-side disclosure should have identified the existing Class A approval rights affecting the inherited Class B interest. The record should be clarified. That was exactly what I wanted. Not my parents' house, not the lake place, not their vehicles, not Dad's company. I wanted the record to stop pretending their inherited interest was unrestricted when they had already been told it was not. My terms were simple. The undue influence allegation would be withdrawn in writing. The family estate reconciliation and beneficiary acknowledgement would be withdrawn. Dad would correct the lender and state that no trust assets or trust approval had been committed as support for his restructuring. Martin would file the appropriate supplemental clarification concerning Northgate's existing Class A approval rights and the prior notices. For 6 months, any request involving the trust would go through counsel. Dad stared at me. And the company? What about it? The redevelopment project. I knew what he wanted me to say. I could still write a check. I could still sign a limited support letter. I could still turn his emergency into my responsibility and call it peace. I thought about Nathan's question. Would that end the argument or establish the price of your silence? Restructure what you own, I said. Dad looked away. 3 weeks later, Martin filed the supplemental clarification. The trust stayed outside probate because it had always been outside probate. My parents kept the house, the lake place, the vehicles, the cash, the collectibles, and their Class B Northgate interest. What changed was the description of what that Northgate interest could actually do. The lender stopped treating a warehouse refinance as something Mark could complete with his side of the ownership alone. His original restructuring package died. Foster Commercial Builders did not collapse. Dad sold a non-core commercial property, reduced the redevelopment scope, and secured a smaller facility based on assets he actually controlled. He lost the expansion he wanted. He did not lose his livelihood. That mattered to me because I did not need a fantasy where setting a boundary required everyone on the other side of it to be destroyed. Mom withdrew the undue influence allegation. She contributed to the additional legal costs created by the dispute, and I stopped direct contact with her for several months. Ryan called me 2 weeks later. I owe you an apology. I waited. I accused you of hiding something because Dad's version was easier than asking why he already knew Rebecca's name. It was specific. That mattered. I appreciate that, I said. We did not become instantly close. Trust does not repair itself because someone finds the right sentence. But we started talking again. Mom had a harder time. A few weeks after the correction, she sent an email to extended family saying I had used technical trust loopholes to take almost $3 million away from my parents. I stared at the message for 20 minutes. Old Rachel would have closed the laptop. Old Rachel would have told herself people who mattered would eventually understand. Then I remembered how easily silence had become evidence for someone else's version. I replied once. Grandpa created the trust more than 2 years before his first serious illness. My parents were notified of it during his lifetime. The probate property they inherited remains theirs. The trust property was never theirs, and the Northgate approval rights were part of the company documents before probate. That was all. I did not attach medical records. I did not circulate Dad's email. I did not campaign for relatives to choose me. I corrected the record and stopped. Dad's first apology came a month later. This got out of hand. I told him that was not an apology. Several months later, he tried again. I knew Dad had put the sale proceeds in a trust for you, he said. I convinced myself being your father gave me a say in what you should do with it. That was true. I allowed limited contact after that. No trust discussions. No requests for business money. No documents delivered through Mom. Mom never reached the same place. Her closest attempt was, I wish things had gone differently. I did too. But wishing for a different consequence is not the same as taking responsibility for the choice that caused it. 6 months after probate, Northgate received a legitimate third-party offer to purchase the warehouse property. The buyer wanted a clean transaction and needed approval from both the economic majority and the Class A voting interest held by the trust. For the first time, I was being asked for consent in the way consent was supposed to be requested. No family guilt. No emergency deadline created by somebody else's business. No document pretending my answer had already been decided. Rebecca arranged an independent valuation. The original offer came in low. I did not block it to punish my parents, and I did not approve it just to prove I was cooperative. I asked questions. I reviewed the repair reserve, the tenant obligations, the tax treatment, and the proposed distribution waterfall. Then, I rejected the first number. The buyer came back higher. 2 weeks later, the parties agreed on terms that paid both ownership classes fairly and funded deferred building repairs before distributions were made. I signed the written direction, and Great Lakes executed the trust consent. My parents received the value attached to the units they actually owned. The trust received the value attached to its own interest. Nobody had to pretend one belonged to the other. That was the first time I fully understood what Grandpa had left me. Not just money, not a weapon, a decision. The seller note continued paying. Most of the trust remained invested. Later, I used a modest portion of annual income to create the Walter Foster Trade Scholarship for community college students studying machining, industrial maintenance, and electrical work. Grandpa would have liked that, not because his name was on it, but because he believed useful work deserved respect, whether anyone wore a suit while doing it. His roll-top desk stayed in my home office. One Saturday, Nathan helped me oil the drawer tracks. When we finished, I removed the bottom drawer and looked at the narrow space where the false panel had been. Grandpa's note was still there. Before you sign anything for your father, call Rebecca Hale. Beside it, I placed a copy of Martin's corrected filing and the final Northgate direction I had signed 6 months later. Not as trophies, as reminders that a record can be wrong because someone lied, because someone assumed, or simply because nobody slowed down long enough to make the truth precise. Grandpa used to tell me, a signature is only useful if you know what it attaches you to. I used to think he meant contracts. Now I know a signature can attach you to someone else's debt, someone else's version of history, a family role you never agreed to keep playing, or an obligation created entirely by another person's expectation. My parents claimed Grandpa had left me almost nothing. What he actually left me was something they had spent years assuming they could claim without asking. The right to decide what was mine. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to 10 Can. More important than the subscription, though, remember this: love can ask, family can hope, and people can be disappointed by your answer. But none of those things turn expectation into consent. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can leave behind is not a fight, but a clear record of where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins.